For more on this and the impact of the refugee crisis in Europe, we are joined now by Brian Stewart. He is a senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs and a former CBC journalist. And now, Brian, we are seeing that German police are saying they're expecting about 10,000 refugees to arrive. How can Germany handle those numbers?
Well, Germany's very good at logistics. I mean, it has a long history as a country of accepting refugees, even East German refugees during the Cold War, and many from Eastern Europe. So it's probably the most capable country in Europe and the efficiency stakes of handling this large number of refugees. And remember, it also has a very good economy right now. So, I mean, it is hopeful that there will be many workers among these refugees. It will help its economy. Some of the countries in Europe are not so fortunate in terms of economy, and they're basically extremely pessimistic. But the Germans, I think, will be able to handle 10,000. I mean, they could handle even more, actually. I've worked in Germany. I've seen their abilities, and it's quite spectacular.
And Canadians are waking up to hearing 10,000 refugees arriving in Germany today. That number is how many the Canadian government has agreed to accept here over a matter of years, and it's become a political issue as well. How does that relate?
Over years, you know, one of the things that baffles me about this story is the small numbers involved. I mean, Canadians who in the past have taken in 60,000 here, 60,000 boat people, Hungarians in the tens of thousands, are now looking at figures like 10,000 over 3 years, 2,500 a year. You could fill one theater, big fair-sized theater in a downtown city with that number. It's not a huge number. They'll be sort of almost lost within Canada when they arrive. Canada could take many, many more. It's done so in the past. It too is very good at the logistics. When the public gets involved, when faith groups get involved, when cities and provinces get involved. So it's a very puny number still that we're looking at.
What are you seeing as the difference here in Canada's response compared to other humanitarian crises in recent history?
Well, I think actually the truth is Canada's always dragged its feet at first. It hasn't been impressive off the top of any crisis. But what tends to happen is the public and the media and faith groups get involved. They start pressuring in all great calamities. The Canadian public gets involved and they shame the politicians into finally catching up. I saw Joe Clark the other day admitting that it was the public that shamed the Canadian government into taking 60,000 boat people. They didn't plan to do that. They were going to aim for 6,000. And that's going to happen in this case. I think the numbers we're hearing now are going to be changing quite drastically over the next few months because people realize you're slowing this down because of bureaucracy. This isn't right. You should be able to handle far more people. Your excuses don't wash. Let's get to a serious number. I think that's the dialogue we're going to be happening in about a month from now.
Yeah, and then what do you see happening in Europe and, you know, the situation and how different countries are responding? How does it affect the cohesiveness of the European Union?
It's a great threat. I think the European Union is facing perhaps its greatest threat. I mean, this whole notion of free, no borders within Europe. I covered the setting up of the European Union, and one of the proud things they were always saying is, you know, people will become less nationalistic and more internationalistic with the European Union, but they haven't. Populations in Europe are still very nationalistic. There's a very strong tide of wanting to protect their nation against the big dishwasher effect of throwing everybody together in Europe. So I think it's going to stress the leadership of the European Union enormously to have to come up with some kind of solution that can take in large numbers and everybody can agree on. But I think we will see the end of free movement of peoples within Europe, I think sometime in the next couple of years, I would think.
Okay, and I want to also ask you, Brian, because I know as a journalist, with your expertise, you know the power of what one image can do for the world. That image of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old, his body washed up on the shore of the beach, is that a turning point in this?
It is, and every now and then in history, sometimes every decade or half a decade, there comes one image. Nobody can quite analyze why it is, and it just absolutely rings a humanitarian bell large time. And you know it when you open it, the paper up or turn on television and there's that image. You just know not only is it affecting you in a way that really you haven't been affected for perhaps years, but you also know it's going to affect everybody else, and it's going to change the dialogue of the politics of a country. It's going to change the whole situation.
And you've seen that from your experience?
I've seen that
Ethiopia?
in several occasions. We saw it in Vietnam, the little girl running from the napalm. We certainly saw it in the Ethiopian crisis, the famine crisis, where one or two children seen in the midst of that crisis. So it really swept the whole world with a desire to give and to be a part of it. And we saw it going back through history. In the Second World War, there'd be an image of a small child in the war-torn suburbs of Shanghai, say in China, and that went around viral around the world, people concerned about that one child. So it always happens. You think people are going to get dulled by all the disaster and calamity they watch, but for some reason they don't. They're hardwired still to try and want to save a young child or a mother and her children, or a hopelessly battered family. They still want to do it, and they don't get dulled down, and their response now is just as strong, if not stronger, than it was back in the 70s or the 50s.
And we are seeing Canadians rallying in many cities across the country right
And
now.
Canadians are really impressive when they rally. I mean, sometimes they're a bit slow in rallying, and certainly their politicians are almost always dragging behind. Not always. Brian Mulroney was an extraordinary leader in that regard. But Canadians, when they do rally, they're really quite remarkable because they do it in a very can-do, let's get on with it kind of way that's going to be interesting to watch and uplifting, I think, for everybody to watch.
We'll see how effective as well. Brian, we appreciate your insight. I know you're joining me again next hour, so we'll continue this conversation. Brian Stewart, Senior Fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs and a former CBC journalist.